So there's a saying that is very exciting. It's a saying that I hear everybody say quite often, and it's 5 words. And I imagine everyone in here has either said it recently or will probably say it sometime soon. This is the saying of those 5 words. When it rains, it pours. When it rains, it pours. I want to share with you some examples of what it may look like when it rains, it pours. See if you realize any of these. It may not have rained for 2 whole months, and now that it's started raining, it hasn't stopped for 8 straight days. When it rains, it pours. It looks like everybody in our department at work is sick again today, all at the same time when a project needs to be turned in. Why? Because when it rains, it pours. You know, sometimes we have no customers in the store, 2, 3, 4 hours, and then all of a sudden, 20 plus people come in, all needing service at the same exact time. Because when it rains, it pours. I got fired today. My girlfriend broke up with me. I lost my dog. My mom is sick in the hospital, all in the same week. Because when it rains, it pours. Or the river flooded near my house. And when the water came into our home, it destroyed everything. All of our electronics, all of our clothes. And of course, we didn't have insurance. Because when it rains, it pours. But what about you? What about your life? When it rains in your life, does it pour? You see, most people in this room understand that life is full of chaos. And if you haven't been in the near past a part of a chaotic life, then I suggest that you put the seatbelt on and you buckle in, because the life that you're probably going to have to live is going to be full of some chaos at some point or another. You may, in the near future, lose your job. A very close family relative or a friend or somebody who's close to you may die one day soon. You may end up being asked by everybody and their friend at work to do tasks all at the same time. And everybody will demand of you something at one time or another. And it may feel like everybody needs something for you. Or you may be the person who walks out to your car, and not only do you have 2 flat tires, but you also have a dead car battery, all in the very same day. You see, chaos is a part of all of our lives. But if you are anything like me, when it seems to not only rain, but when it pours in life, you, like myself, can easily start to doubt the Lord. To doubt whether or not God Himself is in control. To doubt whether or not God is truly good, or if God is truly sovereign, and if He really has a plan for your life. Because when it's raining and when it's pouring and life is chaotic, it is easy to doubt the Lord. The question I want to ask today, that I would like the Lord to answer for us through His Word, is, in the chaos of life, when it's raining and it's pouring in our lives, does God really have a purpose? Does God truly have a purpose within the chaos of your life? Not only when it's just raining in your life, but when it's pouring so hard that you can't even see in front of you. Does God truly have a purpose in that? And to answer that question, we're going to be moving along in the life and in the story of Jonah, who we started last week. And we looked at Jonah 1 through 3. So today we're going to finish up chapter 1. And we're going to look at Jonah chapter 1. And we're going to be looking specifically at verses 4 through 16. And we're going to be answering that question. And the answer today is yes. God does have a purpose. He does have a plan for the chaos, for the pouring down rain in your life and in my life. And to answer that, to see the purpose that God has, I believe today that He has two different purposes for the chaos in your life. For the pouring down rain in your life today, or the pouring down rain or the chaos that you're soon going to be a part of, God has two purposes. And today they're going to be one individually for us, and there's going to be one collectively for Him. So if you would, let's start in Jonah chapter 1, and we're going to start in verse 4. And the first point is directly for us today. One of the purposes for chaos in your life is specifically for our growth. The first purpose I like to talk about for the chaos in our life is that chaos is there from God for your growth. Look at verse 4, Jonah chapter 1. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the water, and such a violent storm arose that a ship threatened itself to be broken up. And all of the sailors were afraid. They each cried out to their own God, and they even threw their own cargo into the sea in order to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below, where he lay down, and he fell into a deep sleep. You see, the first thing that we have to understand when we think about our growth is that the Lord has to use chaos in our life. He uses it in my life in order to bring us to an honest realization of who we are. You see, in order to grow somewhere, you have to start from the bottom and move up. So Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 and 5 is an honest reflection. It's a realization of what is actually going on in the story. Look immediately at the very first part. He says that there's not only a storm on the sea, but it's a violent storm. And in case the author did not get your attention with the word violent, he throws another literary tool in there. He goes as far to say that it's so violent that a ship that doesn't have feelings, a ship that doesn't have any emotions, a ship that's not real in terms of personality, but he says the ship threatens to break itself up. You see, as the reader, that should just jump out on the page at you saying, listen, this is such a bad storm. Things are going so bad right now that it's not just a violent storm from the Lord, but the ship is so concerned about how bad it is that the ship is threatening to break itself up because the storm is so bad. That is a way for us as a reader to understand how bad the scene is that we're coming onto. You see, it's kind of like you driving down the road, and in the distance you can see flashing lights up ahead. You may see an ambulance, or you may see a fire truck, or you may see something bad happening ahead. You see, that's what the author is doing here for us today, is he's setting the scene for how bad the situation is. You see, he's not saying that up ahead that there's just a flashing light or two, but if any of you have ever driven on a major accident, all of the traffic stopped, and when you look ahead, what do you see? You see 3 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, EMS personnel. You see it all lighting up the road ahead of you. You see, that's what is happening here in the text. The author is setting up for you how bad the situation is. Not only is it a violent storm that the ship is threatening against itself, but look at what's about to happen. You see, all of the sailors, not just 1 or 2 of them, but all of the sailors were afraid. And they're so afraid that they are going to cry out in fear to their gods, to the gods that they would hope would listen to them. And not only are they going to cry out to their gods, but look at what happens right there in verse 5. They decide to throw overboard all of their cargo. You see, the situation today is so bad, the chaos in the life of these people is so bad that they're willing to throw all of their valuables, everything that they could make money with, everything that they could sustain life with, everything that matters of anything on the ship. All they're worried about is getting through the next 10 minutes. Have you ever been in a situation in life where nothing else the rest of the week matters? But these next 10 minutes, getting through this next situation is all you can think about. You see, for them, they're willing to depart with all of the cargo on the ship in order to lighten the ship so that there would be a chance that they may get through the next 10 minutes. But it doesn't stop there. We are then introduced to what Jonah's doing. And it says, but Jonah had gone below deck, and he had fallen asleep. And not only had Jonah fallen asleep, but he was in one of those deep sleeps. One of those sleeps that you and I pray for at night when we lay down, where your brain turns off and your heart turns off, and you settle down in the peace and in the quiet, and you sleep, and you get to that stage of sleep where it's deep, and you want to wake up the next morning refreshed, right? You see, most of us in this room, we pray for that through the peace of the Lord, that the Lord would lay us down peacefully and we would rest, knowing that He is in control of all things. But what's unique about the situation in this story is that's not Jonah. Jonah's not sleeping in contentment. Jonah's not sleeping knowing that the Lord has all things under control and that He's good and He's working something good in the situation. Jonah's actually asleep for the opposite reason. Jonah has laid down and has closed his eyes, and he has basically said, you know what? I really don't care anymore. I've run from the Lord. I've not done what the Lord's told me. I've disobeyed the Lord. And so what's happening is the scene is being set for how low Jonah is in his life. He can't get any farther. I mean, he's at the bottom of the ship, for one, but metaphorically, he can't get any lower in life. He's run from the Lord. The Lord has spoken to him, and he said no. And he runs and runs and runs, and now all of a sudden, there's a storm happening. Not only is there a storm physically happening, but there's a storm happening in the life of Jonah. And God brings this storm for His growth. But you don't know how much He needs to grow until you see how low He is. And so today, this first idea, when it comes to your growth and my growth, the storms of our life, the question is, who do we think we are? Maybe who do other people say we are? Who do we believe that we are? Compared to who we really are. Because this is the story setting up for us an understanding that in order to grow, in order for chaos to be used in your life, in order for storms to be used in your life, you and I need to know who we really are. And we need to come to that honest reflection of who we really are. Because until we do, I don't think that the storms in our life can really grow us the way they need to. Look at verse 6. So the captain went to him, to Jonah, and he said, Jonah, how can you be asleep? Get up and call on your God. We've all called on our gods, so why don't you call on your God? And maybe He will take notice of us. Verse 7, and then the sailors said to each other, well, let's get together and let's cast lots and let's find out who is responsible for this calamity. So they cast their lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And so they asked Jonah, tell us who is responsible for making this trouble for us. What do you think? Where do you come from? What is your country? And from what people are you, Jonah? And in verse 7, we get a word here. It's the word for responsibility. This word for responsibility is the word that's going to drive the life of Jonah that we're going to talk about. He says it twice. He says it in verse 7 in order to find out who is responsible for this calamity. And not only that, in verse 8, they come to him and he says it again. Tell us who is responsible. As any good parent or grandparent in this room knows, one of the greatest things you could ever teach your children or your grandchildren is how to grow up and be responsible. It's a difficult lesson in life that we have to model and teach our children and our grandchildren. But a young man or a young woman who is a responsible young man or young woman in this world is a great young man and young woman. Responsibility is such a difficult thing to teach within the world and within the culture. But one of the things that's even harder than that is that spiritually, if you want to grow in your relationship with the Lord, if you want to grow in the way that you handle the calamities and the difficulties and the chaos in your life, you have to learn how to be a man or a woman who is responsible. You see, up to this point, Jonah has shown a lack of responsibility. You know, Jonah is a prophet of God. He is a leader of God. When people look at him, they see, well, this is somebody that God would want to be in charge or to be a spiritual leader. And Jonah is not that. He doesn't do what the Lord says. And when fork comes in the road to make the right decision or the wrong decision, up to this point, he's made the wrong decision. And it's important that when they come to him and they ask him the question, who are you? This is another opportunity for Jonah to be honest and to be real and to quit telling the lies and to quit running and to quit disobeying. And so they say, Jonah, who are you? Where are you from? Who are your people? What country are you from? And I want you to understand that even though he's acted irresponsibly up to this point, that the Lord gives him another chance. And so he answers. And for the first time in the story, up to this point, for the first time in the story, Jonah is honest. He says what's truthful. He hasn't done or said any truthful things up to this point, but here he begins to be honest. And in verse 8, Jonah says, I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. You see, this is the first time that Jonah is actually coming to the realization of who he is and who God is. You see, last week, I kind of shared with you that as a prophet, that Jonah would think, hey, God's in charge of all of the land, and so maybe if I go the opposite direction, and maybe if I get on a boat and go all the way out to the sea, that he would be deceived into believing that Jonah would be deceived in believing that God didn't really own all the water. And maybe he could get away from the Lord if he ran out into the water. But the truth of the matter comes to a realization when Jonah actually sits down and he says, listen, I am a Hebrew. I serve the Lord of heaven and earth, and also the same one who is in charge of both the sea and the land. You see, one of the first things that you and I have to do if we're going to grow through the chaos is we have to be honest with who we are, a true reflection of who we are, and also a true and honest appeal to who God is. And God is in control of all things. Not only is he in charge of the land, not only is he in charge of the employer, not only is he in charge of the government, not only is he in charge of the school district, not only is he in charge of the church and the courthouse and everything in between, but God shows here that he is in charge of the wind and the waves and all of the sea. And this is a great opportunity. This is a great building stone for the life of Jonah as he begins to move up. And he begins to start the process of growing in the chaos. Look at verses 10, starting in verse 10. So this terrified the sailors, and they asked, Jonah, what have you done? Because they knew that he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. And the sea was getting rougher and rougher, and so they asked him, Jonah, what should we do in order to make the sea calm down? And this is a fork in the road that is of great importance, because Jonah knows what the right thing to do is going to be. But like you and like myself, often I know what the right thing is. But when the time comes and the decision comes, and you can go one way or you can go another, very easily and far too often we go the wrong way. Up until this point, Jonah, when the fork in the road comes and he has a chance to either go and do the right thing or choose to do the wrong thing, up to this point, Jonah has blatantly chosen the wrong way. But look at what he says. Jonah in verse 12, he says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm, because I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. As bad as the situation is, as bad as the chaos and the storms in the life of Jonah are, God uses the storm and this chaos in order to bring growth in the life of Jonah. Just in these 8 verses, look at how far low he was and how he took responsibility, how he realized who he was honestly and who God is honestly, and then he takes responsibility. I mean, it's like a masterpiece that is unfolding before our eyes in terms of who Jonah is. And he takes the responsibility because he says, listen, I could tell you all kinds of stories about what's going on here, but I'm going to be truthful. I'm going to be honest. And in order to get out of this situation, you are going to have to pick me up and you're going to have to throw me overboard because it's my fault. It's my fault that this has happened to us today. The question is, what kind of storms are you in today? What kind of chaos is surrounding your life? What kind of things are happening to you right now, this week? And how many of them are a result of something you've done? You see, the Lord is trying to grow us physically, but He's also trying to grow us spiritually. And one of the ways He does that is He uses the storms of life to bring you to the realization of who you really are. Not what other people think you are, but who you really are. And that He is in control. And ultimately, He wants you to take responsibility for the things that you've done. And when that happens, some amazing things happen in your life and in my life. But we have to come to the end of ourselves so that we can ultimately take responsibility and say, listen, I need to be picked up, thrown overboard. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's my fault that these things are happening to us right here, right now, today. So pick me up, throw me aside, because that's the only way it's going to get better. You want to talk about a leader? That is a man who can be a leader. So not only do the chaos and the storms and the pouring down rain happen for our growth, I mean, look at the life and the growth in the life of Jonah, but they also happen for God's glory. For His glory is a theme all throughout this book, and it's the point number 2. Listen to what happens as a result of Jonah being responsible and growing as a man. Verse 13, but instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than it was before. So they cried, but listen to who they cried to. They cried to the Lord. Up to this point, they have each cried out to their own gods, small g, the ones that they thought were in control. But now, because of Jonah's responsibility and because of Jonah's leadership in his life, they are now crying out to the Lord. O Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, O Lord, you have done as you pleased. And then they, the sailors, took Jonah and they threw him overboard. And the raging sea grew calm. And at this, the men greatly feared the Lord. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord. And they made vows to him. You see, not only is God wanting to receive the glory for working in the life of Jonah. You see, all the things that God works in the life of Jonah, we as a reader get to see and understand. But God is also wanting to work in the life of Jonah because of all of the people around Jonah are going to come to fear the Lord. You see, not only does God want to work in your life through the difficulties and the calamities and the chaos, but as He grows you in your life, you can't imagine the people around you that are watching, that are looking, and that the Lord is moving in their life because He's growing you in your life. These sailors, men who wanted nothing to do with the Lord, the God, through the life of Jonah and through ultimately his obedience for taking responsibility for his actions and his worship of the Lord, through that, these men come to fear and worship the Lord. Not only is God going to get the glory for working in the life of Jonah, but God gets a great glory and worship because these sailors come to know the Lord. You see, your life matters. How you deal with the chaos in your life matters. God has a plan for the pouring down rain in your life right now. It's ultimately for you to grow physically and you to grow spiritually as you learn to take responsibility for who you are as God made you. But also, He wants to use the chaos in your life for His glory. Because God is doing big things. And everybody around you can see that in your life. So the application is pretty simple today. It may be simple, but it's hard to do. In the chaos, in the pouring down rain, will you embrace the chaos? Will you embrace the things that are happening in your life? Why? Because God wants to use it to grow you spiritually, and He also wants to use it for His glory. And so if you are in the midst of chaos right now, if you're in the midst of a difficult storm of your life, then will you come to an honest representation of who you are, an honest reflection of who He is, and will you take responsibility for the things that are happening in your life, ultimately so that you can grow and so that God can be glorified. You see, we're going to stand and we're going to sing a song that just says, we trust in Him. So will you stand today and stand collectively as a family that says, we want to trust in Jesus.